All right. Hello, everybody. Um, Welcome to yet another month of MacAdmin Monthly. I will preface this a little bit with saying that, Ed and I had some back and forth whether we were going to hold this meeting at all this month, sort of given everything that's going on in the world. And we decided that it would still be good to sort of have these conversations. We know people are looking for them, but absolutely do not feel guilty if you are watching this recorded in the future at some point because you had things to go deal with and take care of. That's really important. So, not dwelling on that, we have a great guest this month, Erik Gomez, who's currently at Uber. And I definitely consider Erik very much sort of on the vanguard of a lot of the new ways, particularly MDM, of managing and deploying Macs and iOS devices. So welcome, Erik. And I'm pretty much just going to let you wrap and, let people ask questions and let the questions flow. So for the people that don't know you, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks. So I've been with Uber for about 2 years. Prior to that, I actually worked at Pinterest, and then I worked at school districts, kind of like Victor and several other Mac admins that have kind of watched their careers move into tech. But yeah, I'm a senior client platform engineer at Uber right now. We focused on macOS, Windows, and Linux. And my day-to-day has kind of been for the past 2 years MDM and Chef. Just kind of focused on that. And then collectively trying to wrangle all of our technologies into a standard baseline so it's scalable across all of our platforms.
So senior client platform engineer, what does that entail at Uber? What is that role? And how many of you are there, if you can answer that?
Yeah, so let's see, total team size, if we count, so unlike some of these other teams, we're all cross-functional. So I know that some CP teams and other companies are like dedicated to their craft. But if we talk about what we call endpoint, which is macOS, Linux, and Linux, there are 4 full-time employees, and that covers about 60,000 devices. Then we have only 2 people on mobility. That's what we consider our iOS, Android, Chrome OS platform. And then our Uber Eats platform, there's 2 on there as well. So I think we have a total of 9, I think is the number. And then we have a few contractors as well, but they're more operational and less engineering.
I think the first question that just jumps out to me is you mentioned your cross-functional, your team. How much do you try to unify the experience for the end user versus saying, well, our Windows stuff is good at this and does this. Our Mac stuff is good at this and does this. And, we handle things this way because it's native or a better experience on that platform versus trying to say like, okay, everyone at Uber is going to get the same experience no matter what platform they're on.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think we focus more on the back-end technologies to kind of stay consistent with each other. But front end, we try to pick whatever makes the most sense. So obviously we're using Managed Software Center. We have not deployed the AirWatch agent because we don't want to confuse people with 2 different user experiences on macOS. For Windows, we actually do deploy that. We don't have Chocolatey Enterprise, so we can't really use some of the front end features. So we've opted for, we mask the AirWatch GUI in different ways. So we're kind of running PowerShell that runs behind the scenes, runs either Chef or Gorilla, but to the end user, they're just clicking a button and it's having experience. So we've really focused on kind of unifying that, but we definitely don't want to just arbitrarily unify the platforms to our own detriment or to the user's detriment.
Yeah, that's great. It kind of reminds me a little bit. I was having a chat with someone recently, and they were saying that they were trying to choose the best way of doing things, and they said, well, if we choose this thing, end users are going to have to type this really long, ugly command line every time they want to do something. And like my argument was like, well, if the technology is good, any sysadmin worth their salt is like, you're going to abstract that away from the end user and make it easier for them if the rest of the experience is better. And I'm glad we're seeing that more and more. Like sysadmins have to bring something to the table, right? And it sounds like you're doing just that, right? Like we're going to make the end user experience, as good as possible. I will fully admit, like we do have discernible differences. I do think our Mac OS experience is the best of the three, followed by probably actually Linux and then Windows. But that's mainly through attrition. We've had some problems there, and so keeping a DevOps-driven Windows CPE is actually quite difficult. And so that has led to some, I wouldn't say problems, but just some challenges that we still have to solve. Yeah. It's funny because I sort of dropped out of the Windows world a very long time ago. But I still have some friends that are Windows developers in bigger shops, and yeah, their experiences and ways of doing things are just completely different than anything I would sort of dream up or imagine. It's really sort of like its own thing, and you kind of have to dig into that. Go.
Yeah, the inventor of PowerShell, Jeffrey Snover, he disdains kind of GUI admins. I know I don't want to get into GUI admin versus non-GUI admin, but he basically is told, the future of Windows is a DevOps-driven model. And I think that engineers are still kind of coupling with that dissonance because Microsoft is still, creating GUI-driven products. But now you see something like WinGet, those type of features, their commitment to open source, the Linux subsystem. I think you're trying to see them make meaningful progress there. And I think the people that follow that model will have the most success long-term in Windows.
Yeah, I completely agree. And a question on the chat asking for a friend, Rich Troughton in this case. What are the challenges for Windows CPEs? Is it rapid iteration? I guess the question is like, what's holding them back from jumping into this?
The rapid iteration is definitely one. We're working on that actually, the past few weeks. But that is a hard problem, especially when we give Mac OS device by default. So even our Windows engineers, they are running on Mac OS. They have vagrant instances or development boxes and kind of iterating through that. But honestly, the biggest challenge that I think our team sees is PowerShell and Ruby and how they exist with each other. And it's kind of the same thing where like you look at the PyObjective-C bridge that exists on Mac OS. Python allows you to have all these different things, but there's not a Ruby Objective-C bridge. And so some of the things that you try to get into things that you want more advanced, you have to go into command lines, or you try to write maybe a Ruby to Python Objective-C bridge, which you don't really want to do. But I think that ultimately reduces the iteration and also increases complexity sometimes. So I think that's actually the number one thing. It impacts both Mac OS and Windows. But there are confusing things like PowerShell maybe doesn't return what Ruby expects in standard out. So now you have to convert that to maybe JSON, and then your Ruby interprets that JSON. But there's just more moving parts, and because you have more moving parts, you can have more errors that could occur or cases that you don't handle, and that's, I think, what actually causes the most churn. Interesting.
So I think that there were a few interesting things that came out of that for me. One question is, why Ruby? Like, is that
that's a question that we ask ourselves all the time. It's because we are on Chef, right? So okay. That's mainly it. But it is a question that we keep asking ourselves. I think not to dive too deep on that, but Microsoft has their DevOps model, the PowerShell DevOps model, but that doesn't seem to be used widely for client machines. And it seems that even Microsoft is kind of focused on server infrastructure there. If they would make a pivot and kind of make it more robust for client machines, I think we would actually have a wider adoption of that.
Oh, that's interesting. The other thing that caught my attention from what you were saying just before was that even your Windows developers get Macs. And why? I guess it was my question. Like, I feel like if your job is sort of like all Windows all the time, that should be the platform you're living on.
So they do have, well, this is, I probably can't get too in depth of why, but there are developer tools that Uber has to use, and we are incumbent upon our masters in prod. And so if they don't have tools that are on Windows, it's kind of hard to develop properly. So it's this kind of, I think Uber still has a lot to do there. Again, the Linux subsystem actually is helping us.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, that's without diving too deep, that's one of the main reasons. But then also, actually some of our Windows engineers at home, they use Mac OS now. And so they actually like the ecosystem and some of the functionalities.
Cool. That's interesting. Can you say, and if you can't, just let us know, like percentage-wise, the breakdown of your fleet? So not production machines, but end-user machines, X% Mac, X% Linux, X% Windows.
Pre-COVID or post-COVID?
Interesting. I didn't even think about that, but I presume you're going to say post-COVID Mac OS went up.
Post-COVID Windows went up.
Really?
By 30,000.
Why is that?
Virtual desktops.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah, so not physical hardware, but
yeah.
Windows.
If we talk only physical hardware, Mac OS is by far our largest platform. But total devices, we kind of figure that the virtual and physical is just nothing. It doesn't matter. But Windows is now by far our #1 platform.
Why did that go up post-COVID if people have their Mac with, like, why is what they were doing in the office not the same as what they're doing at home?
Shared machines is ultimately what it is. So we had a lot of, centers of excellence is what we call them internally. And that was just our support system. So they would share shifts. There was 3 shifts every day, and they used Windows machines. Suddenly, those locations and offices are closing due to COVID, and so we have nothing to give them. We can allow them to take these shared machines home, but that's kind of not going to help the other 2/3 of the company. So we had to quickly spin up what we could. We could not get Chrome OS. Every company in the world was buying those machines. We actually couldn't get Windows machines quickly enough either. So we needed to spin something up, and Amazon was actually a great partner for that. We were able to spin up as much as we needed. I think, I can't say, but we're probably one of the largest companies using AWS now for workspaces.
Yeah. And why Windows? Because you could virtualize it, or because you're running something that demanded Windows, or both?
Well, mostly because that's what we could virtualize.
Yeah.
So if we look at AWS and what they offer, they do not offer Linux as an option at the moment. They obviously don't give Mac OS either. So we had to use Windows. But I think if we could have had our option, I think we would have picked Mac OS if we could have virtualized it quickly enough. We did. Well, we maybe talked to some of those providers, and they could not scale to the size that we needed.
Sure. Yeah. Makes sense. How much, you mentioned Chef, how much would you say you're dependent on open source?
Quite a bit. Yeah, quite a bit. So we use many open source tools. In fact, let's see. I have my Mac DevOps slide. I will just go through them really quickly. So install applications, Chef, Crypt, a tool called FDCTL, which we haven't open sourced yet, Monkey, Gorilla, Nudge, Microsoft's CSPs, which I consider that open source because it's just documentation. We use ElkStack, FileBeat, Sal, GoSal. So really, the only thing that is paid for is our MDM.
Wow, that's nice. So some of those things that you mentioned are tools created in the Mac community from outside of Uber. Some of those things you mentioned are things that you've created at Uber and open sourced.
That's correct.
Yeah. Which of those things that you've created would you say you're sort of like has had the biggest impact or you're happiest with? Or...
Not happy with any of them, but as far as I think what maybe has had the most meaningful impact would be install applications for myself, at least.
I'm sorry, which was that?
Install applications, the provisioning tool that we use for MDM.
Yeah, I guess so. So that helps your onboarding and set up workflow.
Yeah, it's critical. I mean, Nudge was pretty important too, and I guess UMAD was as well. I didn't mention that, but they don't have as much day-to-day impact, which install applications is right on every single Mac OS device. And we use it for other purposes as well.
Interesting. For people who aren't familiar with those tools, maybe give a quick rundown.
Yeah, so Nudge is a tool that we use to enforce macOS updates. And as we've seen with software update being, I don't know, for lack of a better term, gimped, I guess, it's had its feature sets removed. You kind of have to have more of a user-initiated workflow. And so Nudge is just a way to unify your software update mechanisms, whether it's a major macOS upgrade or a minor macOS upgrade, and then have an enforcement that nudges the user to get onto the version of macOS that you want. So that's Nudge. UMAD is a similar tool, but for enrolling devices into MDM. So we only really used this one time, and that was 2 years ago when we needed to wrangle everyone to enroll into MDM. So that just allowed them to do UAMDM, DEP enrolled, or convert their previous MDM, if they were like a tester, into UAMDM. So yeah, it's just, again, another unified mechanism. So they didn't have to know all the different workflows, or they don't have to run sudo profiles, renew type enrollment, or if you were on an older machine, what was it, MDM client? I can't remember, whatever the other one was. That's how long it's been. But yeah, it was just a way to unify those. And then install applications, that is a provisioning tool. So when your device enrolls into MDM, MDM can install any arbitrary package with either the install application API or the install enterprise application API. The only thing is, though, is that this has traditionally been limited to one package. If you try to send two packages at the same time, MDM client had a bug that it would kind of freak out and it wouldn't accept one of those packages. And so that's why I put the S on install applications. Is it was a method that I could have a very small package that MDM could install and then install as many packages as I wanted. It also supports user level scripts, root scripts. So you can create an artisanally crafted provisioning workflow that is customized to your environment.
Yeah, I know a lot of the people here right on the stream have had similar challenges, and I want to open it up to everyone. But there is one question before we get too far away from it in the chat, and this kind of goes back to the virtualization that you were talking about. Why did you go AWS workstations over other platforms, such as Azure's Windows Virtual Desktop? That's from Scott Blake.
That's honestly, we didn't look at that particularly. I think we are still getting into the Azure workflows. So while we have Intune kind of currently in flux, we don't have autopilot. And that's mainly because Microsoft's licensing model, at scale, it can get very costly. So we're still working with Microsoft. And I think because of that, the dollar numbers were different. Whereas kind of AWS, we already have a really solid partnership with them, and we can work faster than we could with Microsoft.
Okay. Yeah. Makes sense. I mean, it's certainly. I don't want to say. Well, people weren't given a lot of time to make decisions, and sometimes, right? Like, oh, everyone's working from home now. Great. We have to make some some decisions. Oh, I do see that there's a separate chat, not the YouTube chat, but there's a separate chat. So some more questions that people did type in earlier. The first one was from Victor, and Victor, you're right on the stream. You can just shout it out. Go to it, man.
Sure. Yeah. So I was wondering, was Chef, like you're talking about the DevOps sort of environment for Windows versus macOS. Do you find that it's becoming easier or harder to manage Windows with Chef over time? Like, is Microsoft putting an effort to a certain extent? And how would you answer the same question with regards to Apple and macOS?
I kind of find Microsoft getting easier to manage. So one of the things, I mentioned this earlier, but the CSPs. So that's, I think, content service providers that Microsoft gives you. The documentation is great, and it allows you to manage MDM in various ways. But what they don't really tell you is that MDM is just it's just a file that exists on disk. And so unlike MDM client on macOS, you can write your own provider, whether it's Puppet or Chef or PowerShell, and you can change these CSPs. You just have to look at the documentation. And so there's a couple of guides online. If you look, there's a PowerShell to MDM conversion tool that are really smart. I can't remember his name, but he kind of open sourced some of these, and they're really, really powerful. And there was kind of the inspiration for what we've been thinking internally, which is, yes, we could use AirWatch to deliver the CSPs, but we could have much more granular control over those CSPs with configuration management. And that's something that I don't see Apple doing. I kind of see them doing the opposite of that. So yeah, I feel like it's easier. There are some challenges that you have to figure out, but it does lend itself to more of a DevOps workflow. And then of course Mac OS. If you don't have anything nice to say, you don't say anything at all. I think that's kind of where I want to stand right now.
Since this is sort of like a Mac focused forum, what would you say is your current like sort of biggest challenge deploying and managing Macs once they're in the fleet?
Well, so one of the decisions that we made is that our depth profile is removable. And we did that mainly because we were concerned that if a machine, someone breaks the keychain or someone, I don't know, just does something weird and the machine cannot communicate, your only real option is to reimage, or you can have, obtuse commands in the recovery partition. So we said, let's make that removable. We can then automate with UMAD and get them into UA. Like we could silently install it and then UAMDM it. But I think what we found is that in times of, I guess, crisis, I don't want to get too in depth in this, but in certain instances, users might destroy MDM, and it's even easier for them to destroy MDM when the profile is removable. And so then that has cascading effects. Our kernel extensions stop working. Maybe that's a good thing or a bad thing. But other configurations we end up losing. So as Apple has kind of put more and more behind MDM, it does make things challenging.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other questions from anyone on the stream?
What are you looking forward with 10.16, or as far as management related changes?
Things I'm looking forward to. It's hard to say. There's obviously rumblings of some things, maybe what's going to be deprecated, what's not going to be deprecated. I wouldn't be sad if kernel extensions were deprecated. I would be sad if other things were deprecated, like the profiles command. I think there's a lot of really cool things that various MacAdmins have done in this industry over the past, since 10.7 came out, that are pretty awesome. But I would not, I'm not going to, if that happens, I'm going to be pretty sad about that. But as far as like what I'm looking forward to, honestly, the only thing that I'm looking forward to is running our provisioning on top of it and seeing if it works. And if it works, that will make me happy.
Yeah, agreed. I was gonna have a similar question, but like any WWDC wishes? Like if you could sort of just have a wish, oh, Apple, you find a genie lamp on the beach and you say, at WWDC 2020, Apple will announce.
I would actually like for them to deprecate, get rid of let's just get rid of Python altogether, so we can make meaningful workflows across the industry. I think a lot of us have said, all right, we'll get to it when it's there. So if Apple could actually break that sooner rather than later, I think it would force everyone to think around those problems. That would actually include Bash as well. If Zeesh is really going to become the de facto shell, I would like to see them kind of reduce the footprint. The other wish that I would want is faster updates. They're terribly slow.
Yeah, I agree with you on the Python case. Python, I think for me personally, has become sort of like my favorite language to goof around in, but my least favorite language to actually do anything in, because, the environment is like, oh, I have like 6 different versions of Python in my system and the environments are all different. And like sometimes just figuring out those basic things gets incredibly frustrating. And if my systems actually started in a clean slate and I wasn't fighting with a system Python plus other versions of Python, I would be happier. But yeah, that's all.
I'm looking at the comments. There's one other thing that Scott kind of made me think about. So this was one change that caught me by surprise. And I'm not sure if I've ever seen documentation around this, but when 10.15 came out, user level and device level profiles are now all non-removable. So there used to be a removable and non-removable flag that when you installed a profile via MDM, you could uninstall that. They got rid of that to match the iOS model. And I actually really miss that. So for our 802.1x certificates, we deploy that via MDM, but sometimes they get into a bad state. And it would be awesome if the user could just uninstall the MDM profile in the GUI, and then MDM comes back in 30 minutes and it reapplies it. But because they made it unremovable now, we have to do everything via the MDM. And so that's actually added more complexity to our service desk. And there's been some challenges there that I did not like.
Yeah. I think, again, I know a lot of people on the stream are deeply involved with MDM and sort of like dealing with all that. And we've seen some good strides, but obviously we're still sort of chasing down improvements. I have been a little out of the loop on sort of being like the direct point of contact for that. Would people who are more involved in that say Apple's listening, or it's still incredibly frustrating?
My personal frustration keeps growing, because on one hand, it seems like they are listening to some things, but at the same time, it's obvious that they are not dedicating the kind of resources that they would need to make MDM succeed. So what I mean by that, we've filed requests during last WWDC that I'm just getting feedback about, now in the last weeks before this WWDC. And it's I've told you guys this a year ago, and then there's other things where it's we've been asking for many years and they get ignored until eventually Apple one day, messages you out of the blue and is are you still interested in this? And there's no transparency, and it's hard to know how they're prioritizing things. And it still seems they're sort of they're not looking to make MDM something you want to use because it's making things easier. They're it's their place to uncheck all the security issues and say, oh, by the way, if you have MDM, you can actually bypass that. But otherwise, even today, they updated, they added --ignore back to the beta. I shouldn't say because it's a beta, but but they added a feature, they removed the feature last release. They added it back, but now it's only for devices which are enrolled in MDM. And it's you couldn't. We've offered feedback of like, here's a better way to do this via MDM. It requires more work, but here's how you should do it. And that got ignored. And it's just like, well, we'll just have the thing keep working and not provide a more meaningful option. And I'll pull Sam into this because he was talking about how Windows does have, options for like managing software updates and enforcement, and like all of those things are built into the OS. So at least from my perspective, Microsoft's investing more in everything they do than Apple.
Yeah, like with a really light touch on Windows, you can just set some GPOs or local GPOs or through Intune or however. They have very customizable settings where if you want to have things updated, and like not everything is possible, but if you want to say have updates be deferred for a few days and then ensure that they're all updated a couple weeks later, you can do that. And Apple just doesn't really have anything there. I think we do end up in a fairly good state. Like if you don't want to defer anything, like you're going to be okay if you like manage everything to be on. Like most of your devices are going to get updated pretty quickly, but there's just a real lack of controls without external forces.
I concur.
So maybe we should all open bugs with Apple or open feedback with Apple and just have screenshots of like GPOs and be like, hey, this is exactly what I want to be able to do. And not all those GPOs have been around for a long time. Like some of the best controls have come around in very recent versions of Windows 10.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing, and we've had some wonderful CPEs or MacAdmins, however you want to call them, join Apple. And I feel in some ways we've lost them to some degree into the ether, where I know that at times I know they're being spokespeople for us, but I think that they also have to toe the line that they're ultimately Apple employees and they can only push so far. And so I guess without calling them out or blaming anyone, I just felt like there would have been more meaningful changes that I would have loved to see. And that hasn't happened.
Question from the chat from Jeremy saying this kind of goes back to the profiles being uninstallable. Wouldn't the hope be that your 802.1x profiles don't get wonky over time?
Yeah, but I'm not convinced that the Apple engineers even know how this technology works, to be honest. There is maybe one or two, but they're not part of the MDM team that builds the MDM payloads.
Yeah,
but yeah, I would love for it to. I'd love for it to understand when a user has deleted a certificate to reinstall a certificate. I would understand. I would love for it to be kind of decoupled. The systems are kind of coupled together. So if I need to, let's say, change a certificate authority, I have to redeploy that profile to every single device. Where if it was one setting that I could update, there's no need to change the certificate yet. We'll rotate that later, but it's just very inflexible.
Yeah. Any other questions for Erik? Well, I know everyone. I know the open source stuff. Thank you for releasing that and getting that out to the world. I know a bunch of people that use some of those things. And my team at work, huge fan of the Uber engineering blog and some of those large scale problems that get so that's real fun. We did raise the specter of WDC a little earlier. It caught me by surprise when I looked at it today that it's like 2 weeks away. It's kind of on top of us. That also means the rumors are swirling, and of course the big rumor today is that Apple will be announcing ARM-based Macs, which is certainly a long time rumor, but this seems like we have the most credible rumor that Apple will actually announce them. I think that would be exciting. I don't know how that impacts everyone. Would everyone actually be excited for that, or it's a no op for most people?
I think the question is this going to be Windows 8 on ARM, or is this going to be more of a Windows 10X, or is it going to be something entirely different? Like, we've seen potential ARM transitions happen in the past. They haven't gone too well. I think it really just depends on the bridge. Like, is Intel going to allow them to have a software bridge, or is it going to be the end of x86 applications? I think until we kind of know that answer, it's going to be hard to know how well users will accept it.
Well, I think we've got to, I mean, I've been through 2 processor transitions with Apple, and like we know what that looked like, and it was burning the bridges after you cross them, right? Like, they're not going to be building anything like that will be really, if they can't do Rosetta, if they can't do like a real simple compatibility mode, we're going to be seeing things like fat binaries and stuff like that for a long time. But I think there's a proven track record. Like, these are the chips they're talking about putting into these Macs. They've been putting into their iOS devices for a while, and like they've have a proven track record of making this kernel run on those processors really nicely. So I think it will be painful for developers, which in turn will flow down to being painful for users. But it's going to be, I don't know. So, while they're manufacturing chips, it just seems inevitable that they'll eventually stop doing business with Intel as much as they can.
I think this would be a much longer, like, it might not even really be a transition. Like, I don't think that we're going to see an ARM, like a fully ARM Mac Pro for a long time.
Totally agree. Yeah.
With like a billion PCI Express lanes and like all that stuff. The PowerPC to Intel transition was kind of like, it happened pretty quickly, where like being like, you just weren't going to buy a PowerPC Mac after it got announced. Well, maybe you did because you really wanted one, but I think at this point, like the build tool chains can fairly well support multiple outputs. My question there is just like, how much assembly, like x86 64 assembly code exists within Mac OS applications these days? Like, there's probably some in audio plugins and maybe some games, but
yeah,
it's probably
very
going to be too hard to build apps.
And I also think that this is what Catalyst is aimed at helping solve. In very many cases, if you compile with Catalyst, you can have an iOS app, a Mac app, and I'm sure if it's announced at this WDC that it will also solve the issue of creating a binary for the proper architecture as well.
Sam kind of says something that's interesting though, there was a transition, but is this going to be a dual environment? We see a new iMac Pro in the rumors today as well, with a thin bezel. That's going to be on an Intel platform. So it's clearly that they're still developing devices that we'll see in end of 2019, early 2020 that are not ARM. So there's going to be a very long tail. Maybe it's the Pro line is Intel and the consumer line is not. That could be one aspect they could do.
Yeah. I had
platforms.
Sorry, Sam.
Like, so there's other platforms that support multiple architectures, like Chrome OS runs on ARM, ARM64. It has run on x86 and runs on x86 64. And it doesn't really matter which one you have. It's all well supported. There's some Android apps that don't work on Intel, but like everything works. I think the architecture just kind of will get out of your way. And if we look back at PowerPC, like it was like basically Intel got supported on Tiger. Leopard was the last one that supported PowerPC, and then that was basically it. Like your PowerPC Mac was fading into like the dust within a couple of years. But Apple will keep releasing. I don't think they're going to do like 1017 is the last one to support Intel, and then you're left in the dust. Like, we'll have this dual architecture for a long time.
Yeah, I would agree with that only because, you know, Apple just released a machine, an Intel-based machine that will cost you $15,000-ish. Like, how quickly do you want to obsolete those? You know, so yeah, I can kind of see, as mentioned, Intel sort of still holding down the Pro or maybe the high-end line, and ARM sort of just moves up from the bottom and eventually subsumes everything. But yeah, if I just drop 10 or 15K on a Mac and it was obsoleted by 1017, I would absolutely be flipping tables.
Well, they should have put water cooling in it, like the G5, and then they'd all break in 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, the other thing though is I'm thinking is, let's just say they drop Intel, but they do something different. The Pro line could be AMD, because AMD is also smoking Intel right now. And, you know, they've done that in the past. I could see them doing it again. And I would be pretty happy if they went to an AMD platform.
Yeah, I think that's one of those things that were brought up like real early on when Apple, like 15 years ago, when Apple announced the Intel transition. Like, oh, well, maybe we'll eventually see AMD, you know, chips as viable. But I think part of the issue, maybe it's changed in 15 years, one would hope, just that Intel had the raw processing ability to keep up with Apple and also work with Apple. You know, I wound up speaking to an Intel engineer at the time, and you know, again, this goes back whatever 12, 15 years. But you know, when Apple came to Intel and said, we have this idea for this tiny machine that we're going to call the Air eventually, right? And we need Intel to really create small, low power, you know, chips that don't put off a ton of heat. And you know, the engineer that I spoke to loved working on that challenge. And he said, like, no other manufacturer was coming to Intel to ask questions like that, or get them to sort of think in a new way, versus, you know, your Dell or, you know, whoever else at the time was just like, oh, Intel, this is what you're putting out. Great. We're going to build a machine around that. So,
yep. But if you keep up with the PC space, though,
interesting partnership.
No, what it is, but I think if you look, like, Intel has dominated AMD for 10 years. I mean, maybe even longer than that. But that changed last year with Ryzen 2. And so if you keep up with the PC space, you see that they have absolutely dominated Intel now. Intel is it's Apple's chips, probably at the top right now, even though they're still just being used in iPads and tvOS and iOS. But they're very, very fast. And then AMD has almost double their speeds, and they use less heat, less power. So I don't know why Apple wants to continue partnering with Intel, even for the Pro line or whatever their lines are. I do think AMD is the right choice right now.
Yeah, well, that would be super interesting if Apple made that choice. I mean, just before we went live, Ed and I were talking about this a little bit, that, you know, for me, like, the PowerPC to Intel transition, it brought a lot of good things to Apple. It brought a lot of good things to the Mac OS platform. But at the same time, if you were deep into, you know, Sam brought up writing assembly, you know, how much is that actually done anymore? It was done a fair amount in the PowerPC days. But we went from this amazing architecture to probably the crappiest architecture possible, right? Like the x86 architecture, it was and kind of still is kind of the crappiest architecture. Like, it's gotten better since Apple took it on. But at the time, we went from, you know, a ton of registers to a small number of registers and a completely different, and I would possibly argue worse instruction set, and like all those things in that transition were really painful in some ways. What PowerPC was doing with AltiVec and Floating Point at the time was so much better than Intel's whatever they called it at the time, multimedia extensions, or so I don't know. I think that'll be different this time around, moving from Intel to ARM, and we'll see what they can do with the sort of the GPU space. I don't know.
I just one of the things that I was just thinking of with that transition, was, again, and I don't think that the ARM thing will really be a transition, is that I don't think that Apple will put out garbage ARM Macs. The first Intel Macs, a lot of them were just garbage. Probably the worst Mac ever made was the Core Solo Mac Mini. Because
sorry,
it was underpowered.
Yeah,
I had to run Rosetta for everything. I had just bought a G4 Mini, and my friend bought a Core Solo Mini and was like, "This is the worst thing ever," and was like, "I want this out of my house," and just gave it to me. And this is not really like a forced transition like the PowerPC one was. Apple was for real. There was no more headroom in PowerPC from IBM at least. So.
Well, I guess there was headroom, but it was growing to be such a power-hungry and hot chip. They couldn't get it in a mobile device. They couldn't get it in a laptop anymore. So they were definitely limited by that. But thank you for reminding me of that, Sam, because again, Ed and I were discussing this a little bit before we went live, and I couldn't remember that it was the Mini. I knew one of the first Intel Macs were Core Solo based, and I skipped right over it. But my memory was telling me it was one of the laptops. But thank you. The Core Solo Mac Mini, that was it.
And that was the worst Mac ever. It wasn't the first MacBook Air with the iPod hard drive. It was that Core Solo Mini.
They might give each other a run for first prize there, but okay.
That does bring up an interesting question, though. Spinning Rust, is that something that we think maybe in 2020 Apple will kind of finally get rid of? These 5,400 RPM mechanical hard drives, and just their entire line at this point should be flash storage, but they still have a few outliers.
Really? I didn't realize that. Where is their spinning Rust? In the iMac?
Yeah, iMac. Yeah. I mean, as long as putting SSD means they can't deliver the cheapest iMac at $1,200, they're not going to do it.
It'll be replaced with eMMC on the T2, and it'll be even worse. Set your expectations as low as they can go.
That's interesting. Yeah, I guess I'm surprised. I forgot that was still an option in the low end iMac, because that's not a great experience anymore. It should all be SSD.
Yeah, no, I mean, when I was still in education, that's really all that we could afford. That was really what tanked those machines. So we'd have amazing CPUs at the time, lots of RAM, but then spinning Rust would just slow it down. It was a shame.
But the upgrade on the cheapest iMac, the upgrade to SSD cuts your storage by 75% and costs you almost $300.
Yeah.
You have a company with $100 billion in cash as well. I think they could afford, getting rid of that. Their profits for just that little one machine.
But I think you're right. And there's a comment in the chat from Jeremy Agostino. Spinning Rust may be trash canned with the announcement of no more Fusion, but I could see an EDU only iMac with a spinning hard drive. And that makes a lot of sense, because like you said, education, they're usually budget constrained.
Yeah, you have to pick as many machines as you can get for as cheap as you can to have the most impact for your students.
Yep.
I just got that. I don't see schools buying iMacs in the end of 2020 for computer labs. Those budgets are not being prioritized.
Yeah.
Well, that's a whole other can of worms, though. Is can you even have labs right now with social distancing? those kind of ideas are gone.
Well, it's okay because
Yeah.
educational budgets will be slashed as well, so everything will shrink.
I think I see Jeremy asking, do you need more than 128 gigs? It's like, well, yeah, you have to have all of the Adobe products. That takes at least 800 gigs. So
Yeah. Yep. Agreed. Yeah. The question of labs and social distancing, I don't know. I don't want to go too far down that road because I don't have any inside information, but that's not going to last for forever, right? The social distancing and staying away from schools. I don't think any company that's represented here has announced going remote fully, right? Like, I think everyone's offices are being cautious in reopening, but there is a plan to reopen at some point, even if it's not this calendar year. I'm really curious about the companies that have announced sort of like, hey, we've proven we can go remote only, so we're going to be remote only from now on. And I know Spotify was definitely one of the companies that surprised me with that announcement. And I'm curious to see how that works out in 2, 3, 4 years. I've personally been a remote employee for 2 years now, or a little bit more. But I know my best interactions with my teammates were when I traveled to an office and I sat there with people for a week and worked face to face with people and could have very quick interactions and turn my monitor. And even just things like going to dinner, because now we know each other as real people. And when we do have a video conference, there's a different connection there from people that I've only met remotely. So I'm there are companies, GitHub, GitLab, right, are fully remote and have proven that model can work, absolutely. But I think for companies that have sort of grown up with an office, they might miss it over time. They might miss those interactions over time. I don't know. That's just my feeling on that. And yeah, Jeremy asked, does Twitter count in that category too? And I guess they did announce, like, I don't really, I didn't mention Twitter because I don't remember their exact announcement. And I think their announcement was more, and someone can correct me if they remember it better, but Twitter's announcement was more along the lines of like, well, people can choose to work from home if they want. Like, we're not going to force anyone to come back to an office.
Yeah, that was my interpretation as well.
Yeah. It wasn't, hey, we're going all remote all the time, no matter what. So,
I think there's a big difference between remote option and remote first. And
yes.
Yeah, as someone that's been a remote worker for almost 3 years now, I can say that I would rather have an office. I'm the type of person that really likes to engage with people. I used to kind of deny to myself that I was a people person. I would say I'm not a people person. But when you work with yourself for this long period of time, you definitely want human interactions. And I've told this to people that I work with, but for me, COVID has actually been more human engagement than before, because now my wife works at home and I see someone all throughout the day, which is before it was just a few hours per day that I'd have real human connection. So I think it's not for everyone, but I think that's the thing, is that ultimately companies do need to be more flexible. Slack, I think, now has remote options, but it was always really ironic to me that Slack needed everyone in SF when they're a communication company. And so I do think it should be the option, and I think that having the flexibility is great. That's probably the only positivity that has come from COVID. But personally speaking, if I had the option, I would be in an office with my peers every day.
Yeah. I can agree with that, and I agree with sort of being flexible about it, right? Like, but that was a good way of putting it. Any other questions for Erik about Uber, about work, about deployments? All right. Thank you, Erik, for joining us this month. I think that was really great. I really appreciate it. I appreciate the insights. any general questions from anyone? Not about Uber, not about Erik, not about working from home. All right. I think everyone knows that we kind of normally wrap up with upcoming events and conferences, and that's been obviously on hold for a bit. But some conferences are coming back virtual only, making announcements. I'm trying to remember. I think Mac DevOps is either right upon us or just happened. I don't remember.
Starts tomorrow, actually.
Starts tomorrow. Okay, well, there's a plug for them. That's always a great event that I haven't been able to get to as much as I like, but my times in attendance were always great topics, great people, run by Matt X. Hopefully, wishing him all the best with this new mode of delivering some of this content, because I think with remote conferences, I've attended a few now, and I think it's definitely challenging. One of the events that we raise from time to time here is Empire Hacking. There's an Empire Hacking tonight, which I'm not attending because I am just tired of sitting in front of my screen all day. And they're an interesting group in that they never record their presentations. So even though they're streaming them now, they're not recording them and making them available later. So I think that's an interesting decision. Like if you want to attend, you sort of have to attend and be present and watch it. Whereas I find the opposite with a lot of these conferences now, that they're streaming them, they're recording them, you can get them later on, which sometimes makes me less incentivized to pay attention, thinking like, oh, I'll just be able to get the recording later, and I have this work thing, and I'm sitting in the same place that I do for work every day, so I have to do this work and get it done, and I'll just watch that other stuff later. But then that also means there's such a flood of information that I never had access to before, because if I wanted to go to a conference, I had to physically travel to this conference and scope out the time for it and be present. So I don't know. I admit I'm struggling a little bit with remote conferences.
I was too. I mean, there was a conference I don't want to name a few weeks ago that happened, and I felt like it wasn't ideal. They kind of pre-recorded everything, and there was really heavy cuts, and so it felt not, I wouldn't say inauthentic, but it was jarring at times. For you're watching people as we interact. There's little micro pauses that we all have as we're thinking. Those pauses were cut out, and so it's just weird phrases that happen, and it threw my brain off personally. I gave them feedback, but not to plug Mac DevOps YVR, but they are doing it completely live. Nate and I are going to do a small presentation, and we were actually practicing it earlier with the team, with Matt. And I like the technology that they've come up with. It's unique. I haven't seen anyone else kind of do that. Typical Matt in his ways. So I think it's going to be exciting, and there's a couple of things I'm actually really curious to see. Tim Perfett's doing something, Graham Gilbert, Joel Rennick. Let's see. I think Sam himself is doing one as well, and then I know Tim Sutton's doing one, Lucas Hall. So I'm really looking forward to some of these sessions.
Yeah, that's great. I looked at the lineup, and it looks like a great lineup. So that's great. Someone in chat said MacAdmins every Thursday through June and July. I don't know what.
Yeah, they're doing a campfire session is what they call it.
Oh, Penn State MacAdmins. Yes, got it. Yeah, I thought that was an interesting choice. So how many of those have actually happened already?
One or two? I know one for sure. Maybe
one for
two.
Sure. Yeah. I don't know if anyone's attended those. I have not.
I did what you did. I was attending it, but then I had a tab open with work, and the next thing I know, it's been 45 minutes, and I never paid attention to it.
Yeah. That can be tough. Like, again, I think the experience can be made, I don't know, as good as possible for streaming conferences, but the end user, you, me, right? Like, we're sitting in the same place that we always sit. I don't know. Maybe that's advice that conferences should start to give. Just like, go to a different room in your house or go to a different place and watch this on a different device, because it's a tough challenge with work, I think.
Yeah, I think tomorrow I'm going to use my personal machine to watch the sessions, just so I can stay away from these tools.
Yeah, definitely. Smart. I don't know if there are any other events coming up that anyone cares to plug or remind me about. I know, I guess I don't know. I thought I think everything through the end of the year, though, has all said, their events will be virtual, remote. I
mean, I think, again, we already talked about it, but the big one is WWDC in 2 weeks. So
that's interesting, because I am anxious to see how Apple handles that, because if there's anyone who will at least try to provide a great experience and do something unique, I think it's Apple. So I think my attention will be heavily focused on not only the content, but the experience and how Apple deals with that.
I mean, I feel like the main setting that they're going to do will be in the Steve Jobs Theater.
Mm-hmm.
It's just after that, when you have all the breakout sessions, how you attend them all, I think that is probably going to be the remote sessions. But I imagine they're going to do a standard keynote that we've seen from Apple, at least for the first part.
Yeah, I would imagine the same. Yeah, absolutely. But who knows? I don't know. I will be watching it and sort of waiting in anticipation to see how they handle that. Okay. Any other questions, comments, follow up? Going once, going twice. All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining this month. Thank you, Erik, for joining us and sharing some of your experience. And we'll see everyone next month. Stay safe, stay healthy. Thanks.
See ya.
Thank you.